Because there was no one to care for the soil, the spirit formed two figures from earth. These were the first Tiboli man and woman. The Tiboli are a tribal people who live in southern Mindanao in the Philippines. Their ancestral lands are rich in natural resources. These resources include Lakes Cebu, Lahit and Silutan, plus the rivers, valleys and rainforests that surround the lakes. Like other hunting and gathering societies, the Tiboli survived by accommodating themselves to what their ancestral lands could provide. Family dwellings, for instance, were distanced far enough from each other to provide adequate space for families to hunt, fish, and forage for food. Even when they engaged in slash and burn agriculture, they only temporarily altered the environment. Limited to what they could clear by hand, they left enough trees and undergrowth for the forest to grow back. Father Sean McDonough, a Columban missionary who works with the Tiboli, explains how limited slash and burn agriculture worked.
Well, traditionally these people here were hunters and gatherers and slash and burn agriculture. Now you can see examples of the slash and burn agriculture. What happened? People came into a vast forest area and they burned down a certain very small area and planted really in three dimensions. You had in the ground, then you had vines, and then you had nuts. So it was a three-dimensional agricultural or planting operation. Now, they normally stayed there for about 2 to 3 years, and then of course the soil became exhausted, and so they moved on to another area within a clearly defined ancestral territory. Now they wouldn't return to that area for maybe 20 to 30 years. So that gave the soil a chance to regenerate, so the forest came back into that area, regenerated itself, and so the soil was regenerated.
Because the Tiboli adjusted themselves to the process whereby the forest restored the soil's fertility, they came to an understanding of how nature produces food. This understanding intertwines with their creation story. Manudil Magwan tells the story of how soil was found.
The spirit sent 3 birds to look for soil. Each one failed. Then the spirit sent the smallest bird, the bitoti. After a long search, the bitoti found soil from the decomposing body of a human. The spirit told the bitoti to dance on the soil in order to spread it out. Because there was no one to care for the soil, the spirit made 2 figures from earth. These were the first Tiboli, Cluden, and Boy Henwu. Then the spirit sent 3 ants to look for crops to plant. They passed under the soil and gathered all sorts of plants for Cluden and Boy Henwu to grow and eat. That is how we got the food we are eating now.
This story demonstrates an awareness of the decomposition process that forms soil, as well as the relationship between soil and food production. But more importantly, it describes soil as a resource that is difficult to find and gives humans the responsibility to care for the soil. These insights into the nature of soil are crucial for the ecology of the rainforest where the soil is shallow. Unlike other forests, where the organic matter in the soil is allowed to build up through seasonal shedding and decaying of leaves, the soil of the rainforest remains thin, because any decaying matter on the forest floor is rapidly recycled back into the growing trees, plants and vines. The trees in turn provide a canopy which protects the thin soil from the effects of wind, rain and sun. Without this canopy, the soil would soon erode, leaving only barren hills. The Tivoli story of the little bird finding soil goes on to re-emphasize our responsibility to care for this scarce and fragile resource.
Suddenly, as boy had moved, ornaments appeared. Bracelets on her arms and ankles, rings, earrings, combs, necklaces, belts, and other ornaments. The spirit said, "I have given you these ornaments so that you and your descendants will never forget how soil was found by the Bitoti bird." That is why the Tibuli hand down these ornaments from generation to generation.
Tivoli art continues to pass on the story of the environment. The designs found on their traditional fabric, known as Tanalak, represent plants and animals that often play significant roles in their creation stories. The design on this piece of Tanalak, for example, is a stylized image of a frog. According to legend, the frog guarded the original source of water found at the base of the first tree. Using mythological language, the story acknowledges how the forest attracts the clouds and holds the rainfall, thus providing a constant water supply. Even the process of making Tanalak reflects a sense of time that is in tune with nature through ceremony and ritual. Tivoli women make Tanalak from carefully selected strands of abaca, which they fix on a simple loom. They then tie pieces of waxed thread at intervals along the abaca to form the desired pattern. No measuring instrument is used, yet the patterns emerge with precision. The abaca is now ready for dyeing. The waxed thread protects those places it covers, allowing the dye to penetrate only the exposed abaca. The abaca is first dyed black by alternately boiling and steaming it with the leaves of the canalum tree. This procedure continues for up to 3 weeks, until the black dye has saturated the abaca. Then the abaca is dried and some of the waxed thread is removed to expose selected areas to the red dye. The red dye is made from the root of the loco tree. This process is quicker. The roots are simply boiled with the abaca for 2 days. Then the abaca is dried and the last of the waxed thread is removed, exposing the undyed areas, making 3 colors in the fabric: black, red, and the natural cream of the abaca. The dyed fibers are returned to the loom, ready for weaving. The pattern is already evident. The weaving merely binds the dyed fibers together, exposing the full complexity and beauty of the fabric. Each piece of Tanalak takes months to make, during which time these women carefully avoid various taboos and perform precautionary rituals so as to assure the cooperation of the spirit world in their work. Conversely, to make a fabric this painstaking way would be taboo to the modern production expert, whose guiding spirit is the efficient use of time. For the Tivoli, time flows from their intimate contact with the rhythms of nature, and it is this communion with natural time that gives Tivoli women the power to make this exotic fabric. That same sense of time also provides the expanse where the imagination can go beyond the usual and ordinary. The extraordinary exploits of the Tiboli's legendary chieftain, Tudbulul, for example, are still enjoyed and relived in the epic poem of the tribe. Even the chanting of this epic requires an effort that is far beyond the usual capacity of a singer. The epic is 25 hours long and is sung completely from memory. Mendong, who sings the Tudbulul epic at major Tiboli feasts, said she received the story in a vision from a woman named Lentinum. Lentinum told her that if she missed one word, she would die. Lentinum still guides Mendong. To watch her trance-like chanting of this epic makes credible her intimate contact with and support from the spirit world. Both Tiboli art and their sense of time come from having lived for centuries within the natural cycles of their ancestral lands. Yet this closeness to nature is not enough to protect themselves and their ancestral lands from the invasion that now threatens to tax the soil, water and forest beyond their limits. The impetus behind this invasion into the lands of the Tiboli began far away and centuries ago in Europe. It was there that the Industrial Revolution introduced technologies that changed the story of human relationship with nature. These technologies developed into corporations and agro-businesses which displaced home-based methods of producing food, clothing and shelter. As people's likes and dislikes were reduced to items of mass-produced uniformity, artistic skills were replaced by the routines of the assembly line. By contrast, Tiboli artists used the lost wax method in brass casting. With this technique, a simple bellows heats the brass until it is molten. The artist crafts a figure in wax. Then he covers it with wet mud to form a mold. This wax figure melts when the mold is hardened in a fire. Emptied of wax, the mold is now ready to receive the molten brass. Since the cast is broken, each work of art is one of a kind. This method of brass casting clearly serves a concern other than production for profit. With the Industrial Revolution, people primarily saw the environment in terms of profit. not as the habitat which provided their basic needs. Profit has become full-scale plunder, as the power and speed of our technologies use up resources faster than natural processes can replenish them. Once the natural resources of one area are depleted, people and their technologies look for a new frontier, where they can once again exploit the Earth's riches. In this process, those who lived harmoniously with nature are pushed out of the way. Tribal people worldwide have been enslaved, displaced, and slaughtered in this endless quest for new frontiers. In the Philippines, settlers, mostly from the central islands called the Visayas, see Mindanao as the new frontier, a promised land of untapped wealth and fortune. Many of these settlers are themselves victims of new frontier expansion, being denied access to farmland in the lowland valleys because of the presence of huge agro-business corporations. In the valley just below the Tiboli lands, for example, Dole Pineapple, a division of Castle and Cook Corporation, has the use of tens of thousands of hectares of prime farmland for growing pineapples, a luxury fruit for the supermarkets of Europe, North America and Japan. With the arrival of the Visayans and their expectations of new wealth, the Tiboli have become easy victims. Unaccustomed to money economy and borrowing procedures, the Tiboli soon began to lose their ancestral lands and the precious works of art that they had handed down from generation to generation. Since Tiboli lands and art intertwine to form the story of their origin and identity, the loss of these possessions points to a disintegration of the Tiboli world. This disintegration is dramatized on Market Day. Since the Tiboli have little access to capital, the Visayan vendors allow them to mortgage their land and precious heirlooms for salt, kerosene, soap, and other items that simply attract the eye. The mortgage procedure is simple. The Tiboli are allowed to accumulate a debt at a Visayan's store, provided they use their land and precious artifacts as collateral. Most Tiboli cannot read, so they have no way of checking if the debt is accurately recorded. Rarely can the Tiboli pay the debt, so eventually they lose their land and precious heirlooms. The loss of these artifacts signals a loss of the legends they represent. Tiboli stories and art, which embodied a concern for their habitat, are gradually being replaced by stories which promote the plunder of this new frontier. The quest of a new frontier has already scarred the ancestral lands of the Tiboli. New settlers have crowded the lakes with fish pens and overstocked them to such a degree that the fish no longer grow. Meanwhile, nearby hills have been plowed to the point where the topsoil has been severely eroded. The Visayan farmers and storekeepers were the first to invade the cultural and territorial world of the Tiboli, but they only prepare the way for a second invasion that ultimately threatens to wipe out both the environment and the Tiboli culture. This second assault begins with logging. With a newly cut road into the heart of the rainforest, these trees become accessible. Modern machinery can easily strip a forest and destroy the thin soil covering. According to recent estimates, logging companies cut 170,000 hectares of forest and watershed each year in the Philippines. Unlike traditional hand-cleared slash-and-burn agriculture, which allowed the forest to grow back, the agriculture that follows the logging companies leads to disaster. Farmers who plant in the wake of bulldozers and chainsaws find that the exposed soil erodes so completely that the forest has no chance to recover. When the rains come, the soil runs off, silting up riverbeds and causing serious flooding in the lowlands. The destruction of the rainforest means the annihilation of thousands of living species. Father McDonough comments on the religious significance of this biocide.
So we have to learn to live within the limits of the natural world, and biocide is the destruction, the forever, of particular life forms, and they can never be reconstituted. No matter what there is written, for example, in that forest, the story of 300 million years is written there. It can never be duplicated. If that forest is destroyed and all the life forms destroyed there, nothing can ever put it back together again. And we will be much, much the poorer as a human society. And we've got to get that understanding and get it in its... I continually emphasize that religion is a very significant element, because I think the changes that are called for, only something as deep-seated as religion can help to bring them about. Economic concerns won't change this plunder mentality. It's only something that sees the earth as a religious, as a sacred reality, and sacred into the future, that will do that. And as you, the example you gave, like moral people will be appalled at murder, appalled at genocide, and yet don't even consider biocide, the destruction of species, as a moral question at all, when actually it's the ultimate moral question.
The assault on the Tiboli world continues with the proposed dam for Lake Cebu and Silutan. The preliminary study for the dam said it would produce electricity to stimulate industry and provide water to irrigate the lowlands, where high-yield rice strains demand a constant and well-regulated water supply. In the short term, these high-yield grains produce huge harvests, but they also need ever-increasing amounts of petrochemical fertilizers. These fertilizers are not only expensive, they work to decrease the humus content of the soil, especially in areas where the crops are not rotated. Bombarded by these fertilizers, plus the necessary pesticides and herbicides, the soil eventually loses its natural fertility and water-holding capacity. In this context, the proposed dam becomes part of a system that increases the farmer's dependency on expensive chemicals, which over the long term decrease the fertility of the soil. Can religious traditions bring back a sense of caring for the land?
Because so often religion is an addenda to the main business of life, to the economic business of life, or the social business of life. In the Western world, religion is a private event, and as such it's very much, it loses its meaning, and people treat it as a very private reality instead of the substance of life itself. So I think that in a sense answers your question, what kinds of things can we bring back? We could bring this back again to the Judeo-Christian tradition, a great sense of land, and that people in the Western world would stop abusing land, as we continually do, as I gave you the example of just continually covering land with tarmac atoms, destroying soil by farming, monocrop farming methods, and endangering the future, and no sense of the future, just we'll get out what we can out of plunder it for 4 to 5 years, what we can. But even now we see the economics of that are actually breaking down. Most farmers in many third world countries, or any first world countries, are actually heavily in debt because they can't support the economic burden that farming is. And unfortunately the lands are falling into the hands of large corporations who will further deplete the soil, like Dole. 20 years from now, when that land is destroyed, when the desert has moved in, Dole will move off elsewhere, leaving nothing. They'll be gone to Thailand or Kenya or wherever else there's comparable soil for growing pineapples. And what will the people there do? Starve. That's what they'll do.
The dam's electricity would also facilitate mining operations. Like other tribal areas in the Philippines, there are many opportunities for mining on the ancestral lands of the Tiboli. The impact of a major mining operation would be disastrous, both for the environment and for the Tiboli people. Their forest and land would be destroyed, and they would get nothing. Instinctively, the Tiboli protested the proposed dam. 2,622 Tiboli signed a petition in which they said,
"This land and these lakes God has given to us. We do not want this land to be destroyed by flood because it is precious to us. Our ancestors were born and buried here. We would rather kill ourselves and our children than witness the terrible destruction the dam would bring."
The reference to collective suicide highlights the bond the Tiboli have with their ancestral lands. Their legends, music, dances, and art flow from this bond. Without this bond, their culture would become a lifeless museum piece. For the casual visitor, the Tiboli are exotic and fascinating. For the settler and developer, they are primitive and stand in the way of progress. Yet, the Tiboli culture holds the story of the environment. It can guide our modern world to an ecologically sound way to feed, clothe, and house a growing population. If this culture dies, the planet Earth loses a voice on behalf of a renewable world. Few such voices remain.
Manan bete ko warag lasunan bete ko gangat kukuman Hey tilap nan dam lumatun sindawan mahin lubon manan makalan kanu sunduni dunga nuli lem benga fajam libun tuje NB na sung BM ne dom nga dung bangam wot na sen do won gi mo go we elem bung BNC dak be na wang we tu na du nam do u phun đừng pha sát bệ lội là xuân về đang vườn dỗ khen tư đà tư mà bên đó ô lo gì đó phun ba giặt vỡ li bôi hù bằng lạ cốt bằng bơ nọ về cả lần bê li
Oi,